Hi, my name is Cally Steussy, and welcome back to the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. Today we're going to be taking a closer look at the final part of our permanent exhibit, which is the section dedicated to redress and the long-term legacy of the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II and of places like Heart Mountain. In the years that followed the end of the war and the closing of the camps, the Japanese American community was very quiet about what they had experienced. There were a number of reasons for this. For many of them, it was too painful to talk about what had happened. Many of them also felt ashamed. They felt that perhaps they had done something wrong in order for this to happen to them. And on top of that, many of them were afraid that if they said anything critical, it could happen again. And they had some reason to be concerned. After all, the Internal Securities Act of 1950 included a section on preventative detention that was pretty much modeled on what had been done to the Japanese Americans during World War II. In the 1960s, however, things began to change. There were a couple of reasons for this. One was that the protests against the Vietnam War opened up a space within American culture for criticizing the government, when that sort of space hadn't really existed before. In addition, the rising energy of the civil rights movement was really shining a spotlight on the racism that was threaded through American culture at the time. And it was starting to raise the question, did we have to accept racism as the price of living in the United States? On top of that, the post-war generation of Japanese Americans, the younger Nisei and the Sansei generations, were starting to come into their own. They were growing to adulthood, and they were starting to ask questions about their families and their history. Even after people began to talk about reopening the conversation of what had happened during World War II, however, there was a lot of division even within the Japanese American community. It roughly divided into three evenly split camps. One group said, don't rock the boat. It happened, it's over, it's not worth digging all of that back up again. Another group wanted monetary redress. They wanted some sort of acknowledgement of the financial losses that the Japanese American community had suffered as a result of the incarceration. The third group wanted a more legislative response. They wanted Congress to review what had happened and to make a conclusion about whether or not this was even constitutional. It took a lot of arguing, a lot of debate, and a lot of public relations work, both within the Japanese American community and amongst the wider American public. But over time, they started to make progress. In 1976, President Ford formally rescinded Executive Order 9066. And then, in 1980, Congress established the Commission on Wartime, Relocation, and Internment of Civilians. The Commission spent about a year and a half going through the documents that had accumulated regarding the decision to incarcerate Japanese Americans and what happened during that incarceration. And they looked over the formal records from the administration and also accounts from the Japanese American community. In addition, they spent about 20 days just interviewing people. This included people from the administration of the time, people who had served within the defense forces on the West Coast, people who were administrators at the camps, but they also interviewed many of the people who had been incarcerated at the camps. And for many of these former incarcerees, this was the first time that they had really spoken out about what had happened to them. Ultimately, in 1983, the Commission published its formal report on what had happened. And in that report, they concluded that the promulgation of Executive Order 9066 was not justified by military necessity, and the decisions which followed from it were not driven by analysis of military conditions. The broad historical causes which shaped these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. One of the important outcomes of the commission was that during the course of their research, they discovered that evidence had been edited or even suppressed when the Supreme Court was judging on several cases that were brought in front of it with regards to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. As a result of this discovery, Gordon Hirabayashi, Fred Korematsu, and Minoru Yasui were able to reopen their cases on the grounds that there had been a miscarriage of justice due to suppressed evidence. As a result, by 1986, they were exonerated of their convictions. In addition, as a result of the commission, President Reagan signed the Civil Rights Act of 1988. This formally recognized that what had happened to the Japanese Americans during World War II was an injustice and gave an official apology to the community for what had happened. In 1990, President Bush gave the first of what came out to be about 60,000 redress checks. These were checks for $20,000 that were given to each of the former incarcerees who were still alive at the time. And then in 2000, President Clinton awarded 20 Medals of Honor to Nisei soldiers from the 442nd who he felt had been denied those honors due to the racism of the times. Then, in 2000, Congress authorized the recognition of the 10 sites of the former camps as historic landmarks. So that's it, right? We've gotten a formal apology and recognition that what happened was wrong. Names have been cleared. Monetary redress has been made, and the sites have even been recognized as important historic landmarks. So why is it that we continue to talk about these camps today? When Congress recognized these sites as historic landmarks, they said, places like Manzanar, Tule Lake, Heart Mountain, Topaz, Amachi, Jerome, and Roar will forever stand as reminders that this nation failed in its most sacred duty to protect its citizens against prejudice, greed, and political expediency. One of the lessons that the Japanese American community took away from what happened in World War II was that this could happen again. As Americans, sometimes it's easy to fall into the assumption that things like concentration camps and mass miscarriages of justice like this can't happen. We have our Constitution, we have the rule of law, we have innocent until presumed guilty. The thing is, all of those things existed during World War II, and they didn't protect the Japanese American community of the West Coast. The reason that we continue talking about these camps is not to cast blame, but rather as a cautionary tale. This could happen again under the right or wrong circumstances. We tell our children the story of the boy who cried wolf. Consider this the story of the country that cried spies. As a result of that, the Japanese American community in the years since has been very much front and forward whenever it looks like we are in danger of repeating the history that happened to them. For example, during the intense backlash against Muslim and Arab Americans in the aftermath of the attack on the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001, Japanese Americans were front and center to say, no, calm down. We can't blame an entire community on the actions of individuals. In addition, Japanese Americans have been very much part of the conversation about the recent creation of camps to hold immigrants and asylum seekers from the southern border of the United States. For others in the Japanese American community, the history of these camps is a little bit more personal. One of the consequences of the intense racism of the early 1900s, the incarceration, and the long silence that came afterward was a loss of connection with cultural heritage for the younger generations that came later. Many of them felt disconnected from both the Japanese culture of their grandparents and also the history of their family as immigrants to the United States. So, for example, the pilgrimages held every year at many of the camps are places where many of these young Japanese Americans can go to connect with the history of their families and of their communities, which is one of the reasons why we were so sad that we had to cancel our pilgrimage this year. In addition, many young Japanese Americans answer this by digging into the history of their families very closely. One good example of that is Setsuko's Secret by Shirley Higuchi, which will be coming out this fall. And we are also actually doing some sneak preview readings from that book as part of our online programming right now, if you would like to take a look at it. The Japanese American community has done their best to make the legacy of this very painful history into something positive, a kind of cautionary story and a reminder to be careful of what we do in the heat of passion. Unfortunately, the story of these camps continues to be relevant today. For example, I mentioned that Fred Korematsu was exonerated in 1980, but in fact, the official legal precedent of his case was only formally repudiated in 2017 during part of the conversation regarding President Trump's Muslim travel ban. This exhibit was created in 2011 when the Interpretive Center was opened. It's been 10 years since then, and the story has continued. There are aspects of that story that we don't show here yet because they happened after our exhibit was built. So, what is this exhibit going to look like within the next 10 years? Thank you for joining us today. If you'd like to support Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation with a donation, you can do so through our online store, linked in the description. If you enjoyed this video, then check out our other online content on YouTube or on Facebook. Also, keep an eye out for new content released every weekday. Thank you again, and enjoy your day.